One of the great benefits of working within constraints is that it demands a certain amount of invention. And in the weird and wonderful world of video games, the limits and boundaries imposed on developers by the hardware of any given era has dictated no small degree of innovation over the years. I always think this is most easily appreciated when looking back at the earliest home consoles, which often played host to games that were astoundingly simple in premise, sometimes by the sheer necessity of having to run on machines that weren't blessed with fantastic processing power. Very often, they would even be drastically retooled or downgraded adaptations of games that appeared on other systems, making it a bit of a lottery as to whether they could capture the feel and spirit of their namesakes. One such game to get this treatment was Jawbreaker, which was first released in 1981 for the Apple II and Atari 8-bit home computers. In its original form, it was a fairly straight Pac-Man clone, but when its developer, John Harris, turned his attention to coding the Atari 2600 version, the technical limitations of the console required a different approach, and the upshot of this was that Atari's wood-grained wonder would go on to receive a substantially different version of the game. Despite being beaten into a markedly different form than previous versions, on the 2600, Jawbreaker's Pac-Man influences are still quite easy to see. What you do here is move your toothy, yellow, not at all copyright infringing on-screen character between horizontal lanes on the screen, gobbling up pellets. But your mission of mass consumption is complicated by the strange, perpetually smiling faces that patrol each lane. These guys basically fill the same role as Pac-Man's ghosts. If one of them collides with you, you'll lose a life. But in another turn of events that's reminiscent of Namco's classic maze game, a giant yellow pill will occasionally appear in the centre of the screen, which, when eaten, renders your smiley foes vulnerable, allowing you to chase them down and eat them for extra points. Clear the screen of those delicious pellets, and you'll move on to the next stage, but not before being treated to a fun little animation where a giant toothbrush flies in from stage right and gives our toothy hero a quick scrub. I'm actually a bit worried about this part though. I mean, I brush my teeth every day, and when I do, it doesn't sound like that. Jawbreaker, my man, you need to book an appointment with a dental technician, because something ain't right there, and maybe you should change over to another brand of toothpaste. Your teeth are still pretty yellow. I'm just saying. This game may not look especially thrilling even by the modest standards of my beloved Atari 2600, but it's got a lot of personality. And what makes it interesting is that, in spite of cribbing most of its major gameplay elements from another, better known and more recognisable game, the way Jawbreaker implements them is actually pretty neat. Earlier versions of this game were so similar to Pac-Man that there were actually some unpleasant ramifications at the time. Atari, who held the rights to Pac-Man back then, evidently weren't best pleased with the appearance of a game that bore such an uncanny resemblance to it. But looking at this version of the game, you certainly couldn't accuse it of being a blatant rip-off, because instead of aping Pac-Man outright, it turns out to be a reasonably fun little game that takes some familiar ideas and repurposes them boldly enough that it feels like its own thing. That's no mean feat for a no-bit video game. The fact that you're jumping from lane to lane in Jawbreaker as opposed to navigating a maze creates a significantly different play experience to Pac-Man, but it's no less frantic. You're only able to move up and down at the outer edges of the screen, or, if you time it right, by zipping through the moving gaps in the walls of each lane. And you need to be ever vigilant for oncoming enemies, because they harass you constantly. It's rare that you'll move into a lane and clear it of pellets in one fell swoop, because those smiling fiends have a knack of popping up at the most inopportune times. The only way you'll clear stages is by playing a game of cat and mouse with them, knowing when to switch lanes and when to follow along behind them. You've really got to be alert though, because they just love to turn on a sixpence and double back towards you in the blink of an eye. Because of this, you have to be on the ball in a way that Pac-Man doesn't necessarily demand. You don't have the breathing space afforded to you in Namco's game to scoot down to a part of the screen where you're not going to be pursued, because it really feels like you don't know where your pursuers are going to appear at any given moment. And that's half the fun as far as I'm concerned, although it does give rise to my criticisms of the game. As nice as it is to feel like you're being kept on your toes, the unpredictable way the enemies appear on screen can result in the odd cheap death now and then. And I must admit, With their pain in the backside gauges apparently dialed up to 11 by default, I was actually hard pressed to tell if the game was doing anything to further challenge me as I progressed through its identical stages. I can live with that though. The only thing that really lets Jawbreaker down for me are its finicky controls. I find that games requiring precision movement at any kind of speed, as this one frequently does, aren't especially well served by the 2600's uncomfortably stiff joystick controller, and I sometimes felt like I was having a bit of a battle with it here. This didn't exactly spoil my fun, but it did lead to frustration as I'd occasionally overshoot the lane I was aiming for or plough into an enemy by accident. That's too bad, because if control was just a bit smoother, I'd be able to recommend this game without reservation. It's tricky enough as it is, without having to wrestle with it. Looking back at Jawbreaker for the purposes of this review, I still found it to be decent fun. There are certainly more complex and immediately appealing games out there for the Atari 2600, but I think it's a good example of the kind of thing it could pull off comfortably. Its real strengths, I think, are its sense of quirky charm and the fact that it's a very straight-ahead kind of game. It's got that pick-up-and-play accessibility that's common to all the console's best titles. And in terms of overall design, it's arguably a work of genius, thanks to the way it executes its more derivative ideas so as to make them feel a bit more original. I just wish that it was maybe a little bit more forgiving though, because even without the annoyance of its somewhat oversensitive controls, it's a very tricky game. Playable, definitely, but it has that slippery feel to it that sometimes makes me wonder how much of the challenge comes from the game itself, and how much is down to controls that could have done with some extra tuning. I appreciate Jawbreaker for what it is though. Games like this demonstrate that even things we've seen before can have a fresh spin put on them, and for that reason alone, I think this is an interesting take on the Pac-Man formula, and worth checking out if you're down with that kind of thing.